Make sure you subscribe to the Below the Surface podcast by Eclipsium in partnership with CRA. We've had the pleasure of speaking with some amazing guests, including Zeno Kova, Richard Hughes, Vincent Zimmer, and more. We discuss topics related to firmware and supply chain security, uncovering those pesky vulnerabilities that lie, well, below the surface in your environments. You can find all the episodes and subscribe by visiting eclipsium.com/podcast or searching for Below the Surface in your favorite podcast catcher.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Karin Dwavetti about getting into a security engineering career. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with John Kinsella. And one quick announcement. On the evening of Monday, May 6, 2024, W2 Communications and Cyber Risk Alliance are bringing Cyber Tacos back to San Francisco. This is part of RSA. So get some free food and drinks as you mingle with cyber professionals from all over the cyber world as they cyber descend on Cyber RSA. Register to secure your spot at securityweekly.com/cybertacos. Oh, we've got two announcements. Get ready for an electrifying experience at the 15th Annual Identiverse. Join over 3,000 identity professionals in Vegas on May 28th to 31st for 4 days packed with dynamic learning and collaboration. As a community member, receive 25% off your Identiverse 2024 tickets using code IDV24-SW25. Register today at securityweekly.com/IDV2024. Mr. Kinsella, now that you've gone to all those links and used all those codes I just mentioned, hopefully you've got some time to chat about the news with me.
I do.
We've missed you for a while, so there's quite a bit of news to catch up on.
Missed you too. I was just thinking really briefly there. Do you think anyone ever uses those discount codes for their passwords?
That would be amazing. Let's see, it's because they've got they're just uppercase and they have a dash, but they probably meet the length requirements. So
we'll have to work with production so we can get those more complex.
Exactly. At least put some exclamation points in there because they're so exciting. And trying to think how to use that into a segue. So it's a good setup because nope, I lost it. So let's talk about command line parsing. So since my brain is attempting to parse the English language right now, it's having a little bit of difficulty. We have been talking, of course, fondly, at least I've been talking quite fondly about Rust. CISA is all about secure design and memory safety languages and no more C and C++. But of course, there are all kinds of other vulnerabilities that can come up in memory safe languages. And one of them is in argument parsing because Windows possibly we'll whisper Windows, of course, has to do things differently. So I pulled out the Rust security advisory that talks a little bit about, it's not POSIX. This is a throwback to our conversation with Karin. Microsoft, of course, has to do it differently. And this isn't a surprise, however. You pulled out, I think, a perhaps even more relevant, insightful article from 10 years ago. Tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, so let's see if we can organize this and catch people up at the same time. How Windows does command line parsing. There's a common C library. I'm not sure library name actually, now that I mention it, but there's a common library on Windows systems that actually, same as with Unix actually at the beginning, where when you type something in, right, and like to execute something, that's just a string. So now it comes down to how do you parse that to figure out what the command, the binary or the shell script or the batch script, whatever that part is, then any arguments after it, right? And okay, well, what's an argument? Is it separated by a space or a dash or a quote, or how do you quote? Or so these are, you start, as we were talking about before, drilling deeper down into the details behind this. And so how Windows does this is a little bit different. Those parsing, in particular, what's a quote versus what's not a quote, and then okay, if you've got two words and there's single quotes around them versus double quotes, there's two arguments or one argument, or how do you do this? And this is where basically coming back to standard C, if you think through, again, same thing, how do you escape a quote? Like, / quote or / single quote. So all that sort of yap ends up coming down to how Windows parses these command line options could be a little different than what a developer is expecting. And the thing is, usually this is in, like I said, that the library that's part of the operating system. So the question becomes, as we saw here with your Rust example, do we fix this in every language out there, or maybe should the OS vendor fix this? And this is not a new problem. Yeah, there's a blog post which I found as part of this. There was a really good discussion. Well, there was a decent discussion on, I think it was OSS security, the open source mailing list. And that's where I found this particular link to this blog post from 2011. So going closer to 15 years, where they talk through what's going on, why it's like this. They've got a test program for you to see and understand. But that's now coming out as we talk about a language that's, memory safe and secure and everything's great about it. You're only as strong as your weakest link. So here we are. Doesn't just affect Rust, but this is the one that I think got a little more attention. And yeah, I don't know what it caught your eye too. So I'm sort of curious, what about that sort of made you want to bring it in here?
And it's one of those things that it seems so simple. Like, really, we're just talking about command line arguments. But as you were pointing out, the thing that stood out for me is it is such a simple thing, but it's inconsistent. And that inconsistency surprises developers. And it comes to that question of, well, what's the secure design here? Should the secure design just be consistent with Unix, do it the Unix way, be predictable the way everyone else does it? Or at least, how do you make this as Windows? How do you make this harder for the users to make the wrong assumptions, misuse it? And I don't want to overemphasize this as a metaphor for general AppSec, but I think it is emblematic of that idea of there's one way to implement command line parsing. There's one way to implement it for how developers are expecting and anticipated to use it. And that will, I think, translate into examples of SQL, concatenation, prepared statements, authentication, things like that. So that it's that aspect that I think is a pretty decent departure point for something that seems so simple we could blink and miss it, that it does actually have consequences for those bigger discussions of how should software be, which I don't think we're going to answer in 30 minutes.
No. And it's, I'm just looking through, I mean, for folks who go through our reader's notes, show notes, there's this, the one I'm talking about is not the link on my story, but if you look actually at the content in there, there's a link out to learn.microsoft.com where this blog post is. Mm-hmm. And they've got a bunch of really great examples. And then here's how you should do this right. And it's, looks like it's, I guess, 30 lines of code. So yeah, a little more complex. And I'm trying to remember, Mike, I don't think command line parsing or like how that looks, I don't think that's part of POSIX itself, right? That's more about the file system in your network standard. So
right,
they've got space to be able to say this is okay.
Yeah, indeed they do. And I also appreciate this as a quick note. You did miss our April Fool's episode where we were pulling the 20 articles from 20 years ago that sounded suspiciously relevant to today. So I definitely appreciate here's a 10-year article that honestly is actually still relevant to problems that developers are running into. So hopefully we'll all learn. Speaking of things that are old, John, just to forge ahead through a couple different news articles, D-Link. So D-Link has, apparently 90,000 or so devices that people are looking up on Shodan, et cetera, that are just dead. In other words, they're exploitable hardware devices out here, routers, essentially with backdoors. In other words, a hard-coded credential. There's no way to change this. There's no firmware update available. There's also no way for the vendor to push a firmware update. And the vendor is saying, it's $300. Go buy something new. I'm perhaps paraphrasing a bit, but read between the lines. That's essentially what's happening here. And this isn't so much a har pick on D-Link or pick on a vendor, but I did want to bring it to that idea of secure design and how do you deal with things that go end of life, even when that end of life is after, perhaps a decade, or it has been a pretty long time. And I don't know if there's something, if you have a quick, immediate reaction to this, or this is something like, well, that common AppSec phrase, it depends.
It depends. We're going to see more and more of this.
I suspected.
It's just
right.
And the problem for those who don't get it, that the cost of the hardware on these things is never the thing, right? It's if I go and buy, if I had one of these and I want to replace it, my time, like anybody's time, is going to be more expensive than whatever it takes to go and get the new thing and put it in and make sure it works the same way and all those things you got to do. But my head starts wondering, like, going forward over time, as I said, like we're going to keep having this. It's like, can someone come out with some sort of a wrapper product that you can keep this thing on your network, but like, I don't know, maybe like a firewall, but something like that allows you to maintain or run with a known piece of kit that's got some issues in it. It just feels like there has to be some other way to address this besides just because pretty much, almost any company out there at some point is either going to discontinue the product or maybe go out of business or both. So when you've got a few tens of thousands or millions of these things out there, how do you handle that? We don't have an answer to this.
Yeah, and it's one of those things we've seen, regulations start to be, especially in the UK, start to be considered in the US about IoT devices. And one of the things here is, do we also expect then just that idea of being able to remotely push upgrades? But you also made the point too that, well, what if the company is also out of business? There's nobody out there to push it, or even worse, somebody takes over that domain name off, they buy it for $10 off eBay, and now, look what they can do. There's open source that you could install on these, but that also, open source, is not well known for necessarily for ease of use, ease of installation for, the general consumer. So it's one thing to say it's available. It's another thing to say it's usable. It's possible. So that's where my head is going when I see, these types of conversations come up or situations.
I sort of think we have to, I think that's one of the better ways of phrasing. So I'll see if I can hold my final thought. But the problem with saying that a vendor can push updates is you've now got a legal exposure for the vendor. If they can push updates and they don't, or they don't do it quick enough, it's like they're now going to have a lawsuit at them. So I can see why there's some sort of reasons you might not want to do that there. But the final point there maybe for me is, maybe that's the law that we should have is there has to be a way for these to be user serviceable from the point of view of, maybe, be able to apply some sort of open source thing to it, have a standard or have some sort of a documented, ABI so people can upload their own firmware or something like that. And for that time when they do go out of business.
Yeah, well, let's continue our vendor and open source conversation about Red Hat. Here's an article you pulled out around GCC.
Yeah, so this was fun. When I saw it at first, I didn't realize who was doing it, but Red Hat's got some great folks over there, as we know from recent experience. And so I didn't know, I don't think, that they've been working on a static analysis tool that's now built into GCC. And where this became interesting for me, what caught my eye, literally, is amongst having all sorts of different, it doesn't seem like it's super mature yet, is my sort of interpretation of this. But one of the pieces of functionality which they've added in here is it won't just detect buffer overflow potential in your code, but they're able to, with ASCII art, actually color ASCII art, it looks like, to visualize that so that the developer can see, oh, here's my string literal. It looks like I am not null terminating it, so there's space after it. So that's how someone could actually access that. And I think from the point of view of, education on the job or education on the project, whatever have it, for the developer to be able to see, oh, that's why I need to fix that. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, and this one, when I was reading your show notes, admittedly, I was like, oh, is this just going to have like the cool Blade Runner, Star Wars kind of ASCII art for the fonts? And by no means, not at all. And the article itself has just a great example where it's a beautiful visual layout that says, here is your problem. Here is this other problem. Here, here's your increment or post increment. Here is your loop issue. And it just is a really nice decoration of just ASCII. So I agree. I do tend to go on to the written word. That's my bias. But every time you bring in one of these types of visualizations, I can't deny how easy it is to understand just at a glance.
I think that the written word, you're very seldom going to beat it for conciseness and being very specific about what you're trying to get across. So that'll be needed. But yeah, I think for someone who, who's going to look at this? It's not going to be the senior developer, maybe once for giggles, but it's going to be someone who's more coming up, or maybe thinking back to our last half. It's like if you're trying to get someone into AppSec, or you're trying to help them learn why buffer overflow is an issue, if they can write a program and then with something as simple as this, you can say, look what you've done, or look why this could be improved. I think that has value.
Now, some other value I'm going to pull into our conversation here is kind of a stew, a gumbo, if you will, of a couple different articles in the sense of there's Microsoft and the CSRB. You pulled out an article about Palo Alto Networks and some RCEs. Wanted to add to this as well. Last week, John, we had talked about Avanti, and they had come out with "We take your security seriously." They didn't use the word seriously. I went and checked, but they had basically, speaking of like 10 and 20 years later, they had essentially the trustworthy computing memo that Bill Gates had sent out back during the early 2000s of IIS has had a couple problems, SQL Slammer, Microsoft SQL Server has had a couple problems. We're going to do things different. Avanti is a security vendor who in 2024 is saying we're going to do things a little different, which doesn't have a good feeling to it. And I pointed out, though, that we still talk about 0 days in Safari, 0 days in Chrome, but my perspective there was that Chrome is demonstrating a complexity. They're demonstrating a forward progress on how they're architecting their software. The types of vulns we see are requiring more work for the attacker. They're sandboxing. They're doing a lot of these things that aren't just a dead simple SQL injection vulnerability. So with that little bit of setup, let's start maybe with the Palo Alto Networks one first. And how does that fit into this little bit of spectrum? I know we haven't talked about the Kinsella scale, so maybe I'm teasing that to come back here.
Yeah, this one would have to be pretty high on the Kinsella scale. So I was thinking through, and I didn't put this into show notes because we had technical difficulties and I had to quit my browser and restart, so I didn't get all the details in here on this one. But the train of thought that I was trying to go down as I was thinking about this is not just so much, yes, it's a perfect 10 CVSS, and there's been a bunch of those recently, but in this one's case, so to talk through really what this is briefly, there's a command injection vulnerability in this thing called Global Protect, which is I originally was calling it a product, but it's actually a feature on Palo Alto firewalls on some of them. So depending on, and they've got this really interesting to me table of like which version of the software you're running, and then is that one, which versions of that, so which subversions of that version are vulnerable, which are not. And it's like you start looking at it like it's a bit of a head scratcher, but it's interesting that they had to put that in there. But okay, so they came up with a new feature, new functionality, zero trust. Ooh, we were talking about that a year or two ago all the time. But there's some sort of command injection. And that's the thing itself. Great, fine. Okay, patch your firewalls. Have a nice day. What was interesting to me is thinking about, there's some vendors, not the obvious, but there's some vendors that, we see so often that we just don't include them in here anymore. And we were talking about this probably, 6-8 weeks ago. But then there's the other ones who, when something happens, like, okay, well, how do they handle it? Do they, are they upfront about it? Are they giving clear directions like this and how to patch or fix? But it's surprising, So a CVSS 10 should always be surprising. If it's not, there's something wrong. But where I'm going here is the whole concept of surprise and recognition of, okay, is this something which, are we seeing this all the time every day? Or, oh, wow, there was a vulnerability in, a firewall vendor who we don't talk about very often. That's what you're sort of striving for, right? Is while surprise is for us being, in the media or journalists, wherever you want to call us, that gives us something to talk about. Ooh, cool, But at the same time, there's a version of that, I think, for the guy who has to go and patch these things, or for someone writing the software is like, okay, that's surprising I did something wrong, or surprising that I need to fix this. How do you, I want that always to be there. If you're like day after day of like, oh, we've got another CVSS 10, or there's another vulnerability in PAN-W or what have you. Okay, now that to me, I think there's a negative sign there, an inverse sign of like, that's something you should be addressing. There should be surprise that I'm hearing about them again. So do we use them? Getting back to the IoT thing, do we have to somehow, I'll say firewall for now, but wrap it or enclose it, or sort of keep that thing sort of separate. So my brain started thinking about that when I was looking at this one, not just so much the issue itself, but they had an issue. Okay, we all have them, but how often do you see them, and is it a big deal, or how do you respond?
Right, and that is nice setup. Thank you for about the CSRB and the Microsoft article. So I did link actually to the Risky Business newsletter, which has, as typical with them, a great write-up about some insights, some takeaways from that. An angle I wanted to push on was, again, perhaps being stuck in the past. One of the things they point out is that there was a signing key that was supposed to stop in 2016, kept being valid. And it was also, there are a lot of snafus that we covered about this, I think a year ago or so, about this signing key was only supposed to be used for certain selection, a certain tranche of customers, but it could be used for anyone. So there was also some verification that was failure around this. And those are the types of things. It's not like, oops, we forgot to revoke a cert, like a one single case, or oops, we forgot to scope a cert. It was a cascade of problems. And that is where you start to have concern. And the CSRB was honestly not very kind. They used, we are concerned, we are troubled. Those were some of the fun language that they used about Microsoft, which was very much around identity. So I think the part of this I wanted to pull out was, if we talked about, with Karin in the last segment about security engineering, there's a significant amount of security engineering that needs to go into identities, humans, services, devices, etc. That, even OAuth is still growing, and with a bunch of different RFCs, there was OAuth 2 Depop that was even specifically called out in this particular CSRB write-up. So even if you've quote unquote implemented OAuth 2, there's probably a lot of extensions and ways to device bind and to have, very ephemeral tokens. And should you just be doing signing keys versus other things? So there's a lot to take apart here from just that perspective of security engineering. So those were the AppSec angle I wanted to pull out of this.
Yeah, there's and we gave this a bit of attention when it came out, but as I was sort of scrolling through this again as you were talking, quote from the Risky Biz article, the CSRB is very critical of what it says is Microsoft's refusal to admit that it doesn't have a good handle on how Storm 0558 acquired this signing key that we're talking about, which is, I remember at the time that was sort of a shocking thing. It's like, wow, you don't know what happened. You're expecting me to trust you. I get big company. Well, I'm not going down that path. There's been another vulnerability came out last day or so, which again I didn't put in the news, but this is around their Kubernetes offering. And again, the concept there of having secure compute, confidential compute systems now that I've talked about a bunch, but you can go and run Kubernetes on them. But it turns out that and I forget the details on it, but there's some issues where someone could come in without credentials and actually get access to your secure compute through Kubernetes, which is not great. So, I think that the sign here is to try and bring it back to application security. Again, I know there's a bunch of great people out there. I know they're doing really great work. There's obviously something going on where it's not getting. We talk about it out of hand right now, but the email that Bill sent out however many years ago now, was it 20? Around when they were having issues with the IE, that's a massive thing for that company to do, to stop and go, okay, we need to fix this. I think many would say that they're probably heading in that direction again. I think what really honestly irks me about this is at the same time that they're having so many issues, they're making a lot of money off this, and like the amount of marketing which goes into, we are a secure company, or we will make you secure, all those type of things is, it makes it difficult. But again, see if I can keep trying to bring it back to AppSec. If you're either using these tools or maybe you're at a company like this and there's issues going on, how do you in your own little world sort of make at least your part better? Can you just focus on your code, or like how you're using those C libraries? And I'm not saying the C library is an issue, but as an example, how do you sort of focus, and maybe if you're lucky enough to have a team or teams, how do you get your teams to be good? So maybe at least your corner of the world, you recognize that there's things swirling around you. How do you sort of focus down and make sure what you're doing is still secure from an application security point of view? That's how I try to focus on this.
Yeah, I think that's a good message, because it comes around to the engineering. Like, how do we get a solution oriented? And I will take a little bit of the lesson from history is, talking about trustworthy computing, and Microsoft made those investments. At the time, IIS had hit, the double decode. There were a bunch of different vulnerabilities that were just super trivial. Directory traversal, by the way, exploitable in IIS. But then Microsoft made that investment, and in the years after, IIS had very, very few. I think it maybe had one in the following decade critical vulnerability, and the others were all medium or low. So it is possible. So, I think, I guess, I wanted to kind of wrap this up, that it's demonstrated as being possible to secure code. But we've talked about with Azure, you've bought a couple of those articles too. That as a cloud service provider, there's where am I going with this? In the modern computing age, there's a lot more responsibility that these cloud service providers need to take on and demonstrate much more appreciation for secure architecture, secure logging, observability, so they can also know what's going on after the fact. So that's maybe a bit of my attempt to be optimistic and looking forward phrase to perhaps sum up that.
I'm trying to remove that company from it, partially because where I am, but at the same time, it's like, how do you, if you're, back again to talking about our previous with Karen, is if you're building up this stack of knowledge, and you have to know, okay, as I mentioned, ICMP, I just picked that one randomly, but you have to know the network, you have to know the protocols on top of it, you need to know, okay, then the OS and then what's going on there, and then going up the stack. It's one thing to learn all those things, but now do you have the faith to trust and either think that your partner's securing these things or that you're able to secure them, whether or not they do or not? I mean, you have to have a very, if you think about it, if you're going to do this right, you have to have an incredibly defensive mindset to go through each of these pieces. Okay, maybe that ICMP packet is not going to be parsed correctly. How can I defend against that? Okay, maybe the OS has I mean, these are even real examples now. The CLI parsing might not be correct. So how would I defend against that? Okay, let's keep going up. Imagine that my cloud provider has got this CLI and that issue exists in there. So maybe not a cloud provider, maybe, I don't know, widget maker. And they've got this CLI thing that they don't know about. Is there a way for me to write my application so that if there's a vulnerability in that CLI and someone's able to access it, can I still be secure? How do I handle that? Okay, now it's back to my code finally. And it's how this, as that stack becomes more complex like this, I think you have to spend a lot of time thinking through that, or somebody does.
Somebody does. And I love how you put that too, because you weren't just saying we need to do more input validation, just input validation harder. You were pointing out a lot of different things of like, well, what if we isolate this? What if we do, segmentation, separation, sandboxing, all these other types of, honestly, engineering techniques, engineering patterns, rather than just, the top 10 list says do input validation. So everybody does that and we can all go home. Don't think that's the case.
Yeah. And again, that comes down to, really briefly, the spirit of, are you trying to pass an audit, or are you trying to make sure your application's secure? But yeah.
Yes. Well, we are trying to make all of our listeners happy. And I think you've done a great job of that this week, John. So we're happy to have you back. Thank you once again. Thank you all listeners for joining us. Do please subscribe, share on the socials, check out the show notes. And speaking of building things well, check out Diamond Roads by Heartbeat Hero. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.